And so as introductions go, I'm GT Ladd. I'm the head coach at Wheaton Water Polo for men's and women's in Norton, Massachusetts. I happen to also be a psychologist and a clinical researcher who does work on addictions. And my background is as a developmental psychopathologist, which is really just a fancy way of saying that I study how people get screwed up over time, but I'm also really interested in how their resilience helps them to recover over time and how these things interact, both pathology and resiliency interact with our developmental context. So I've done a lot of work with adults in gambling disorders. I've been in the field since very early on, when basically myself and my collaborator, Nancy Petrie, published some of the first empirical studies on internet gambling back in 2001. So it's been a while working in this field. But as I said, I'm really, I think, not just interested in adulthood, but I've done a lot of work in youth, adolescent gambling, as well as college populations. I also do work with alcohol disorders, cocaine disorders, and opioid disorders over the course of my career. So gambling is extra interesting to me, as much as it can be at a disordered level really destructive to people. I think it's really interesting because it's essentially a way of thinking and an interaction with our environment and a set of behaviors that we become addicted to, and yet we're not taking in a drug. Our brains are producing the put it in air quotes drug that we become attracted to, and then in some develop a disorder around. And so we're manufacturing our own reactions that we become drawn to and dependent to. So so that's my thing. And then, of course, as a psychologist, I'm always talking to my own athletes about risks that have to do with alcohol, risks that have to do with gambling, and behavioral health in general, which includes depression and anxiety and a whole spectrum of things that folks can struggle with. And so I'm really sensitive to the idea of spreading the word to other coaches and administrators and athletes about the risks that go along with gambling. But I guess the first question to start, like I would in a class that I was teaching, is what is gambling? And in a lot of ways, gambling is so many things, it could be hard to define specifically, but I'm going to try to put it into one sentence. It's essentially any behavior that involves the risk of anything of value on a contingency of chance. So I'm going to risk money on whether this coin is going to be flipped as heads or tails. Okay. And that risk is that I'm going to lose that money. The benefit potentially is that I double my money, or to some extent make more money. But as we usually think of gambling as involving money, I'm here to tell you, having done clinical research, especially when I was down at the University of Connecticut Medical School, working in one of the first major treatment centers for gambling disorders, most of the people who were down and out and really struggling with disordered gambling, money was just one way that they were risking. They were risking their health. They were risking their sexual autonomy. They were risking property. Anything of value that they could put up, they would put up with the possibility that they could gain something of value. And that something of value wasn't always money. Sometimes that value was being freed from debt. So they're not getting money, but they're being freed from some debt. So it gets really complicated at a disordered level. But the one thing that most of us can relate to is that gambling is interesting. Even if we don't do it that often, we're oftentimes pretty interested in it. And that also speaks to the idea that gambling, whether it's being done by college students or anybody across adulthood, and certainly in adolescence and even in childhood, is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. Gambling is not just formalized in industries. It's done in people's living rooms, in their cellars. It's done on street corners, on camping trips. It is everywhere. In fact, it's probably a good chance that gambling may be as old as the human brain has existed, as a modern human brain. You know, chance events and the sort of never-ending pursuit of trying to figure out how to anticipate how those chance events are going to play out has been a fascination of humans probably from the start, ever since the brain developed into sort of higher brain functioning. We just seem to be fascinated by that. And gambling definitely influences the brain and the ways in which we think in very complex ways. So complex that it keeps folks like me in business, where we are always finding important questions that we don't have the answers to, that science could try to contribute to. We just don't have it handled. In a lot of ways, alcohol disorders are a much more straightforward set of pathologies than what we see in disordered gambling. It's very wrapped up in not just the brain, which I'll talk about in a moment, but it's wrapped up in the ways in which we think, our socio-emotional reactions, and the people around us, as well as the cultures. As far as the brain goes, I'm sorry, Kayleigh-Ann, you could put it onto my little outline that I forgot to tell you to proceed the slide, if it'll work. So as far as you could go to, that outline there. Yeah, so as far as the brain goes, I mean, we've got different parts of the brain are involved, and parts of the brain like the nucleus accumbens, which is in charge of rewarding behavior and sensations, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your frontal lobe right above your nose, that's in charge of us being able to inhibit impulses and tap the brakes on our behaviors and make good decisions. It's not surprising that the prefrontal cortex doesn't come to full fruition of development until around 25 years of age. And so our college athletes are still in the formative end stages of maturity, as far as being able to hit the brakes on their impulsive behaviors. The other parts of the brain, around the emotional parts of the emotional centers of the brain, like the amygdala and the hippocampus. These are risk reward, sort of attention and emotional regulation areas. All of these have been linked to gambling, and that is pretty much the human experience. And so the idea that when people have difficulty, whether it's a 21-year-old soccer player or a 51-year-old business person, the idea that you can just stop is just as absurd as it would be if someone had an alcohol disorder. It is truly a DSM criteria dysfunction. All right. And so that's the sort of brain part of it. But then there's also the thinking part. And we know that the brain responds to gambling activities in really powerful ways that set us up to be attracted to risk and keep coming back for it. And in fact, the three things that seem to be the slippery slope for college student gamblers, as well as adults and adolescents, is easy access, the ability to engage in the behavior frequently, and action. So easy access nowadays with the internet makes it amazing. I mean, you could gamble 24/7 on the internet, in your boxer shorts, in your bedroom, anytime you want. You can get as many repetitions or frequency or high rate of gambling as you want, as much as it'll drain your credit card or your parents' credit card. You can get a lot of frequency out of it, and you also can elevate the action. Action, in a gambling parlance, is the idea that you have greater and greater risk with greater and greater potential for benefits. And as individuals gamble more and more, they get bored with levels of action and they need to step it up. If that sounds a lot like tolerance in alcohol use or caffeine use, it's almost precisely that way. So it turns out that, for us caffeine drinkers like yours truly, when I first started drinking caffeine, I would get a little bit of a hit off of a normal, 10-ounce cup of coffee. Fast forward not too long after, I'm upping my volume of caffeine and I'm still maintaining the same hit. It just takes more of the drug to get me there. That's called tolerance. And yet the same thing happens with gambling. And so it is really a slippery slope. We'll talk about that more later when we talk about areas or activities of gambling. So let's look at gambling in college students. Gambling in college student populations has been around for as long as anybody could think of, is certainly as long as there's been college students. College doesn't cause gambling issues. It just like college doesn't cause alcohol problems. It is a context where individuals have a lot of time, they have a lot of stress, they are young, they are impulsive. Remember that prefrontal cortex above the nose that's still developing. They don't tap those brakes of impulsivity very well. So the context, in addition to all kinds of other elements, is ripe for gambling activities, which could be harmless, but the amount of gambling that's occurring now because of online opportunities is pervasive and it's growing. And so studies consistently show that approximately between 72 to 75% of college students, undergraduate college students, regardless of whether they're at a community college or at a college or a university, have gambled at least once in the past year. Now, that in of itself doesn't seem like a big deal, and it doesn't have to be a big deal. Just like we know that 80% of undergraduate students, regardless of the type of college that they're at, have drank alcohol in the past year. That isn't necessarily a problem. So we have to understand is that's just the sort of surface indication of gambling participation. If we take a deeper dive into the research, it gets a little bit more nerve-wracking for us, the folks that are looking out for our college students, whether we're parents or administrators, coaches, or anybody that's interested in their health and welfare. So consistently, studies are reporting that these kids are much more involved in gambling activities, and for college students, the numbers would suggest they run higher rates of disorder. Okay, about 15% of males and 5% of females have been screened as disordered gamblers. So in other words, they fit the DSM criteria. As a matter of context, and I wish if I was sitting in the classroom, I would ask all you guys in the audience what you think the rates for the general adult population are for disordered gambling, which is the DSM criteria. I can't do that, and I don't want to mess up our interface here and try to go into the chat. But for the general adult population, it's about 2%. So the general adult population of disordered gamblers is around 2%. For college student males, it's 15%, and for females, it's 5%. So there's something going on there. And so if we take an even more extensive look and maybe dip into research that's just a little bit older, it's about 5 or 6 years old, but it's a big study. It was done in 2018. It was a meta-analysis, which means they took about 100, I think it was a little bit more than 100 studies, and compiled all of the data that those 100 different studies by different researchers all around the country and Canada looking at college populations. All of that data was compiled and a meta-analysis was done on it. And so that was done by Don Nawak in 2018. What he and his colleagues found is that disordered gambling among college students runs, and this is combining males and females, which is why the numbers I think a little bit smaller, is 6.1% for regular college students and about 6.4% for student athletes in college. If we parsed out males and females, the numbers would go up for males and they would go slightly down for females. Okay. So college students in general have difficulties with gambling, but it looks as though college student athletes have about the same problems. However, well, if we add in folks, the college students who've been screened for risk factors, in other words, they don't meet the DSM criteria yet for disordered gambling, that's the 6%, but they do meet risk factors for it. To use an alcohol analogy, this would be somebody who's had binge drinking in the past week, tends to drink on more days that he or she would than he or she doesn't drink on. These are indications that someone might be developing or near to developing a diagnosable disorder. So at-risk gambling, those rates are pretty high. So it's for college students, it's about 10%. And for college student athletes, it's about almost 9%. So you add the 9% of the kids who are at risk to the 6.4% of student athletes who are diagnosable, then you've got about 15% of student athletes who are either at risk or disordered. And we could just use a blanket statement for them as a group and call them problem gamblers. They may not have a diagnosable disorder yet, but they are on their way. Does that mean they definitely will get a disorder? No. But just like with inappropriate alcohol use, it's a big worry and it's a likelihood. Okay. So that idea of 15% of student athletes at risk for disordered gambling or having disordered gambling is a big number, considering how many student athletes we have. But it's also kind of an enigma to me, even as somebody who studies it, because we do a good job as coaches and administrators and parents talking to our student athletes about health, everything from weight to healthy attitudes towards their bodies to drinking and drug use. And we definitely, increasingly so, I think we could do a better job, talk about gambling. I think the problem, though, is the conversations around gambling are about don't do it and not understanding why kids do it. We talk to kids about alcohol use and we say, be careful with alcohol. Here's the things it could do to you. Here are the reasons why people typically get into ruts with their drinking and get in uncomfortable circumstances with their drinking, but also get in circumstances that might involve health risk. We're kind of used to talking about drugs and alcohol that way, but with gambling, it's sort of a don't do it. Here are the ways you can get in trouble. The NCAA wants you to avoid gambling in these ways and hopes you won't gamble in these other ways. The bottom line is don't do it or you'll get in trouble. That's not really great for protection, especially given the attraction that we see with gambling. Okay, so why don't we go over a really great report? Kayleigh, if you could just back up to the second slide where we introduced this report, because I put it in the wrong order. It was to be the slide before this one. So the NCAA a couple of years ago produced a report, and it had been making reports. COVID kind of interrupted it for about a year and a half, but it had been producing reports that were sort of tracking student athlete gambling. This report is freely available on the internet. You Google it up, just throw into your search terms the title of it. The lead author, Jeffrey Deravinsky, is a world-renowned researcher from McGill in gambling. He's been around as long as me, and he and I were contemporaries for decades. He really does an amazing job, and I'll be sampling over the next several slides some just interesting data that comes out of this, but there's a much more extensive report that if any of you want to read, I certainly encourage you to do so. So why don't we go to the first slide that I have with the data. So this is just giving us some context of which I've already sort of introduced. It's data around whether to what extent these college students, and these are all student athletes, are gambling, and the extent to which they're sports gambling. So they're gambling at all, more than half for the males, and a good, healthy 1/3 for the females. And so the gambling's happening. Now that's past year. Is that the end of the world? Should that in of itself be a marker of risk? No, but like I said, it gives you a good sense of the context of how many people are exposed to this. Your student athletes in your family and on your college team and in your department are definitely gambling. And what I said earlier is that chances are that they may not understand the risks, because we know that 15% of them, if we combine males and females, are probably going to be at risk. In terms of betting on sports, it's a smaller number, but it's still pretty big. We're talking about almost a quarter for the males and a significant but smaller proportion of the females. And then betting on sports frequently, so more than once per month in the past, during the past 12 months, is definitely over 10% for males and pretty negligible for females. So right away, we could acknowledge that there are gender differences that probably have to do with sociocultural norms and learned behaviors that are different among males and females. We'll talk a little bit about this more later, but it's happening. All right, you can turn to the next slide. So this slide is essentially looking at the age of initiation of gambling behaviors. I love the word genesis. It seems pretty dramatic. In my world, in psychology, we refer to it as age of initiation. The one thing we know, and this is certainly a word to the wise on anything that has to do with at-risk behaviors, is the earlier it starts, the more likely someone is going to develop a problem. So we're particularly worried when kids before high school are starting to gamble. And among males, that's a pretty significant amount. Now, again, this is among kids who do gamble. This isn't the entirety of kids. These are the kids that have reported gambling in college. These are student athletes. The question is, when did you start gambling? And so for the student athletes that started before high school, we're really worried about that. We know that when alcohol use starts before high school, it runs tremendous risk for later alcohol abuse and dependency. We know when promiscuous sexual activities start before high school, that we have at-risk behaviors relating to sex that occur. We know any of the drugs, alcohol, risk behaviors, smoking, you name it, it just really sets them up. But high school is not much better, and that's a great proportion of these kids. So essentially, the idea that we would be introducing topics of gambling risk to college student athletes seems a bit naive, given that around 77% of males will have already gambled before they got to college. So they were water polo players when they were in high school. They were soccer players when they were in high school. They were baseball, what have you. They were doing it. So it's a bit naive for us to be waiting to give our lectures about gambling and our cautionary tales and hopefully good information for college. Not to say we shouldn't do it in college, but it might be a bit late for a good 77% of the gambling kids. As far as the girls that gamble, again, still worried about the early initiators. It's not as many early initiators. You notice that a higher percentage of females are starting to gamble in college rather than the males, especially in the 24 study. 52% in high school and a smaller 12% before high school. But the trends are still problematic. We're not happy at it. So the take home for this slide is be on the lookout for early initiation, but be informed that we need to have the preventive measures at our club teams in water polo, our club teams in soccer. That needs to be happening, in my estimation, from the many years that I've been doing this. The sooner you can start talking about gambling and alcohol and having a sex talk and getting kids familiar with risk and protection across the board, the better. Doesn't make it easy conversations, but it certainly is important. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Again, we're all still talking about student athletes in college. It's who's reporting this data. So I put this up here because this speaks to the sort of sociocultural elements of gambling. If you look at the males, where do they, in what sort of social context do they do most of their gambling? It looks like most of them are most likely to gamble with teammates, their friends, friends outside of their team, all right? That gambling alone still is happening. That's still an important consideration. But the vast majority of these student athletes are gambling with others. Why that shouldn't be a surprise to us. We certainly know that the team culture is a core element and a wonderful element of our water polo players and our soccer players. It is a major attraction of being in college athletics, is to be part of a team and part of a camaraderie, a fellowship of like-minded athletes working towards goals in the same way. But it also is the way that these behaviors spread, just like alcohol use behaviors that are inappropriate can spread in teams. I'm going to just pick a crappy word. Team members can infect each other with bad behaviors, and it's not because of one bad egg. It's everyone's hungry for fellowship and to fit in, and so gambling fits right into that. We see slightly different numbers on the female side. I do think it's interesting that family contexts of gambling are more likely for our student athlete females than teammates and friends out of sport. And if we were in a classroom, I'd ask the audience, why do you think that females are different from males on this sort of activity in a team or friendship group? And I pause for you to think, but I'll answer my own question. It's the idea that gambling still is not as socially acceptable among females. And so the idea of taking a chance and being out there and suggesting gambling activities or thinking it's a good idea and pitching that to your female teammates you might have some discomfort worrying if they're going to take it the right way, if they're going to think that you're somehow weird or something like that. But if gambling happens in your family, then it's part of your family tradition. Every Christmas we do scratch tickets in our stockings. By the way, don't do that. Scratch tickets in our stockings, and we do Super Bowl squares, and we bet on the NCAA basketball tournament, and it's our family traditions, and it's fun, and I believe that. But that's their safe place that's enculturated in their family. There's less social acceptability outside of the family for females. And in this case, maybe it protects them. All right, we can go to the next slide. So this is just sort of breaking down. It always begs the question. I know that some of my colleagues who coach at D1 are in the audience, and some of my colleagues that coach D2 and D3 are in the audience. It is pretty similar across the board, but there are noteworthy differences across NCAA divisions. If you notice, if we break down Division I men in the 2024 study, there was around past year gambling of around 45%. It's pretty big. Division II, it was a little bit bigger, and Division III, it was more. Pause for thoughts. I'll answer my own question. One of the theories for why it's more pervasive, it's not over the top more pervasive, but it is significantly different, is that Division III athletes may not get as many of the cautionary lectures from administrators in their department and their coaches as Division I athletes do. Division III athletes also have shorter season. They have more downtime where they are not under the proverbial thumb of their coach and department, doing their own thing. And their own thing may very well be relatively harmless, but that gambling may be a part of it. And so longer seasons in D1, more scaffolding or support, more sort of keeping up with rules and regulations for the team, the department, and the NCAA. So Division III athletes need to get a closer look in terms of their risk management. It's not to say that the Division I athletes are off the hook. There's still 45% of them gambling, and we worry that 45% gambling is a big number, and we're worried about the 15% who might be disordered gamblers. As far as the women go, the trends are similar, right? You look at the Division I women, it's lower than the men at Division I. It's 30%. Division II is a little higher. Division III, higher still. Probably has to do with less scaffolding because the season's shorter, there's more flexibility, and perhaps they get less information. So for my crew of Division III water polo players, they get a lot of talks from me just because, I can annoy them because I just do that. But for other coaches at D3, they may want to integrate some supportive, informative discussions about gambling. Not just that a student athlete shouldn't do it. Certainly that can be part of the rules requirement. But why is gambling happening amongst people, and what are the problems with it? What are the risks? What are the downsides? What are the reasons why gambling is so attractive? Okay. All right, you can go to the next slide. I don't have much use for these two slides. This one's going to be on men. The next one's going to be on female. So I'm going to go pretty quick through it. I don't really care about the numbers. The problem with asking people what activities they gamble on is that these categories are pretty much the same categories that I used when I first broke into the business of gambling research back in 2000, right? There's not many people that bet on horses and dogs anymore, right? That it happens, sure. There's not many people aside that go to casinos that are going to play dice or craps. There are people that do slots. We're not really thinking that many college students do that. Lottery tickets are absolutely a thing, but they're pretty standardized and the action's low, so people move away from them. So these are interesting, but what's really missing is the pervasive and very eclectic collection of online gambling opportunities. Everything from fantasy sports to just hitting prop bets on whether the first pitch is going to be a strike or a ball in the first Red Sox game in April. I mean, there's so much you could do online that researchers nowadays, especially in my domain of looking at risk, are paying much more attention to the heavy access, heavy frequency, and heavy action of online opportunities. And this table doesn't give us a lot of that. So I don't have much use for it. I just wanted to point out that just asking a kid whether he does dice or craps is not going to necessarily out him as being at risk. And you could scooch past the female table now. It's really similar trends, and we'll stick at this one. So this is the percentage of men reporting that they bet on sports. So all this while, we've been talking generally about gambling among student athletes. We said that of those who gamble, around 15% are going to be at risk for disordered gambling. That's the at risk combined with the disordered gamblers. Here's the thing about sports. It turns out that people that bet on sports have higher rates. What I'm saying is not reflected on this table. The table's giving you some context. People that bet on sports have higher rates of dysfunction than most other games of chance that they might bet on. And here's the rub. People who bet on sports online, it's like throwing gasoline on the fire. it runs as much as twice the disorder. And again, I think the obvious reason is that when you're online, you have full access. Remember, those are the big three that we worry about with our student athletes in gambling: access, frequency, and action. You can amp up and hit the accelerator on your access, your frequency, and your action with a press of a button. And so sports in particular are problematic, but sports online are really bad, okay? Or really risky, I should probably say, without hyperbole. So as far as betting on sports, we've got a good chunk of student athletes betting on them. Why isn't that 12% versus 30% among males at the top section? So why isn't that surprising? Well, it's what we said before. The Division I student athletes are getting much more scaffolding or support around avoiding these risky activities. It's still happening despite that support, which is its own issue. But look at those Division III athletes. More than twice the percentage have done occasional past year gambling. And then if we look to the lower left there, that's monthly or more gambling. The same trends appear, that Division I has absolutely problematic percentages, things that make us worry. But man, those Division III athletes are really hitting it on the monthly. And then if you look at the really heavy gamblers, these are all exclusive categories. The Division I athletes are dipping down to just under 2%, but those Division III athletes are holding up almost to 10%. So to me, the take home for these division differences is contextual differences for these student athletes. How much time do they have on their own? How much information do they have? How much scaffolding or support do they have? These are questions that I don't necessarily have the answers to. I have hunches, but I think that we as coaches and administrators need to be aware that despite all the supports and speeches we give to Division I athletes, a lot of them are still gambling and gambling a lot. And maybe for us D3 coaches, maybe our student athletes are not getting enough scaffolding and support and information and speeches, or not the right kind, because they are more than triple in some cases the percentages of participation. Okay, you can go to the next one. I think we're doing pretty good on time. Is that true? All right, great. So if you're gambling on sports, what are you gambling on? These look at men and women and the sports that they've been betting on in the previous year. I don't think that these are particularly telling, except to say that they very much reflect our sociocultural context. NFL has never been more popular than it is right now. If I dare say also the Patriots are going to win the Super Bowl, that's just an aside, and I didn't put a bet on it. But the NFL, not surprisingly, is the top dog when it comes to the chosen activity that individuals are going to bet on. The NBA is a very popular professional sport. It is also going to be bet on, and this is going across so far pretty well across males and females, right? We see similar trends. Okay, so the popularity of the sport, it seems to suggest what kids are going to bet on, but I wouldn't read into it anymore. There's no suggestion that someone who bets on the NFL is any more at risk for disorder than someone who bets on tennis. Okay, the question is, what are the signs and symptoms that are going on that suggest risk or dysfunction? And the top three are the things you want to look at. How, what kind of access are they making to this? Are they on it all the time? Are they frequent in their rates of gambling? And what kind of action are they pursuing? Okay. All right, you can go to the next one. So I thought I'd throw this up just because I've been talking about disordered gambling, the DSM, and I always tell my students in class, I don't expect anybody to ever remember any of these, and this is actually half of the criteria. but it's the sort of more interesting half. But what I wanted to point out is so that we can think about looking at this through the eyes of coaches and administrators and parents who are interacting with our student athletes in college, and think about what this looks like, right? That the reason usually people are gambling in the first place is because it's a distraction. And distractions are fine. People take walks for distractions. People hike, people draw. Distractions are fine. The thing about gambling is that it has many sort of elements to it that make it attractive. The distraction becomes a negative reinforcer. It takes away something that we don't want. I might be anxious or stressed, and I gamble, and it helps me to forget about that anxiety or stress. And that means the next time that I feel anxiety or stress, I might be interested in gambling. I want to go back to it. That's negative reinforcement. But we also get excitement from it and hopefulness, and those are positively reinforcing. And so when I want to feel good, I feel like I've got to gamble so I can get that positive reinforcement. And then occasionally we win, and that's positively reinforcing. But the three together create a contingency where we're usually just doing the activity to do the activity. We think we're doing it to win, but we actually get wrapped up in using this activity to regulate our brain function, to regulate our anxiety, our stress. And when we don't, we get dependent on this behavior. When we don't do it, just like if I skip my caffeine in the morning, I start to have withdrawal. And so if you look at these, criteria, the second criteria is restless or irritable when attempting to cut down or stop gambling. What does that look like? Pause for thoughts. I'll answer my question. It looks like withdrawal, right? Needing to gamble in increasing amounts, number one, needing to gamble in increasing amounts of money in order to achieve the same desired excitement. That looks like, pause, tolerance, right? Has made repeated unsuccessful, this is number three, attempts to control, cut back, or stop gambling. This has to do with compulsive behaviors, right? Behaviors that are difficult to control. We see that in compulsive drug seeking, whether it's alcohol seeking or literal illicit drug seeking. We see that. Number four is often preoccupied with gambling, like having persistent thoughts of reliving past gambling experiences and handicapping games and all that stuff. This preoccupation, this obsessiveness, these are where we in alcohol research call these triggers. They're obsessing over doing it. It dominates their thinking, creating stress and tension. And the only way to relieve that is to actually do it. In the case of drinkers, to actually drink. In the case of gamblers, to actually gamble. All right. And then number five, I won't go through all of them, but the fifth one, I like this one as well because it's very telling. Often gambles when feeling distressed, helpless, guilty, anxious, depressed, stressed, right? That speaks to that sort of big three elements, right? That you have the negative reinforcement, the positive reinforcement, and you have the occasional payout. All of those are really big distractors for these feelings. So my point in dragging this criteria out, at least the elements that I've talked about, is to say that if we're really talking to our student athletes, if we're really noticing them, and us coaches, we spend a lot of time around our athletes, not as much as their teammates do, but we spend a lot of time around them, talking with them, noticing them, evaluating their performance, getting feedback from them, giving feedback to them. We can start plugging into some of these elements. When we notice access and frequency and action in behaviors with our student athletes with regard to gambling, and some of these telltale signs. You guys aren't clinicians. It's not your job to diagnose, but it helps to be a conversation starter. I think that's really important. So I thought maybe I would stop here. I've got verbal diarrhea. I could talk all night about this, but I thought maybe we could do some questions if anybody has them.
Do
No?
you have any suggestions on, starting that conversation, or what would you do after that?
Yeah, and I think the conversation starters can start even before you notice anything that you're worried about. I think conversations can talk. I mean, this is a great weekend of practices to talk about the Super Bowl and say, "Hey, is anybody here doing Super Bowl squares or doing, something that's kind of innocuous that doesn't seem like a trap, and it isn't a trap." To get this sort of conversation started about gambling. And when someone says we're doing squares, it's an opportunity to say, hey, I saw a really cool, really inspirational talk by Coach Ladd, who's a gambling researcher, who's talking about that sometimes when we're feeling really vulnerable, stressed because of school, anxious because we're missing home, bored because we're in the off season, that we oftentimes will turn to gambling because it's interesting. And Dr. Ladd said it was really attractive to people. And I just was wondering if you athletes know what to look for in somebody who might be having a difficulty or a difficult time with gambling. And they're probably going to say no, or they'll say the most obvious answer, which is, well, you have a problem if you lose too much money. And and that's a natural thing to say, but there's much more that you can get into, which is, isn't it possible that if you're gambling to cope with anxiety, that maybe that might be a risk factor, right? That it's not always about how much you lose. That certainly isn't a good thing to lose money, but that is part of the game, right? You lose and sometimes you win. So I think getting conversations started, but also there are associations. I think there's a slide that I had at the end. I don't know if I put it in there for the National Council on Problem Gambling. And for the athletes, there's hotlines, but the website for information and conversation starters has lots of content. I know that in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Council for Problem Gambling has a lot of resources. I know in Connecticut and Rhode Island, there's a lot of resources. And my sense is that in each state, especially also on the West Coast in California, there are resources and state associations for problem gambling that will give information and conversation starters. But I think that's a great thing to bring up. All right.
Thank you so much for taking your time to do this.
It's my pleasure, and I appreciate everyone's time. And certainly, if anyone ever needed to follow up with me with questions, I'd be happy to give whatever information I could.